You're listening to the Fierce Fatty Podcast, episode 154, Fat Bias in the News. Let's do it!
Perfect.
Hello, welcome to this episode. So nice to see you. Thanks for being here. I appreciate it. Today I got my very first subscriber on Ko-fi. I don't know if you remember last episode or if you listened all the way to the end. Ko-fi is another version of Patreon, but one where they give they're better to their content creators. Anyway, so for ages I've been thinking, why don't I just make a some type of thing for folks who want to support this free resource, which is the podcast. 154 episodes now, oh my goodness. So if you want to buy me a coffee, then go to the link in the show notes for Ko-fi. You could just type Ko-fi, K-O-F-I, into the Googles with Fierce Fatty and you'll find me. And you can, buy me a coffee. Or if you want to get something aside from the awesome listening pleasure that is the Fierce Fatty Podcast, you can subscribe, and you can subscribe for as low as $5 a month. You can do $5, $10 or $20, and depending on what you choose, you will get minimum. The lowest is the Size Diversity Resource Guide, which is amazing. It's 37 pages and it's filled with all the resources that you would need as a someone who wants to get more size diversity in their life. So people to follow, podcasts to listen to, books, shows, where to shop, and so like things like where to shop, we've got 450 plus places to shop with like categories on what type of clothes they carry, how much money they cost, where they ship to, etc. It's amazing. Books, we've got over 250 plus book recommendations. So yeah, it's a massive resource. We've also got links to different Facebook groups, science, studies, everything. It's so fucking good. And obviously I'm biased because I made it. But $5 for that? Yes, fucking please. So go to the link in the show notes, or just Google K-O-F-I, Ko-fi, and Fierce Fatty, and you'll find it, and you can get that for as little as $5. If you want something extra perks, we've got extra perks for the bigger just subscriptions, and you can do it and cancel immediately if you want. I prefer if you didn't, but if you want to just get it and cancel it, that's fine. I'm not going to hold it against you. I know I've done that. So yeah, today we're talking about, because I was talking to my therapist today, and we're kind of talking about the trauma that I experienced when I was on a BBC show. If you don't know, I was on a show called Who Are You Calling Fat? It's a 2-part documentary aired on BBC in October 2019, and what it was that I lived in a house with, I think there was 9 of us, fat people. Some people liked being fat, some people didn't like being fat, and a couple of people were just in the middle. And they made a program. It was kind of like, it was pitched as kind of like a social experiment. It was viewed by millions of people, and after it, I have to say trigger warning here. I'm going to talk about suicidal ideation. So if that doesn't feel good for you, skip over the next few minutes. Afterwards, the trauma of recording the show, and then the aftermath of being a fat positive person in the UK and being on the BBC, talking about that was tremendously painful, so much so that I became suicidal. And I think it was only because I had years and years of therapy up to that point. And I was talking to my therapist at that point too, like I always do, that I was able to not die. It was really bad. It was really, really bad. And a lot of what was traumatic was the fact that there was a lack of authenticity in what was presented, and the fact that in the house, in the real life, like, yeah, we had disagreements in regards to fundamental things, but no one was rude to each other. Apart from there was one creepy guy who was just a creep to everyone and no one liked. But everyone was respectful, and no one had any arguments, and so they didn't have a lot of stuff to make it explosive and interesting, right? So they kind of had to create narratives, and although they were technically true in regards to like words came out of people's mouths, they did a good job of highlighting certain views or certain things to make them seem extreme, and they did it in I think unethical ways. And anyway, for the rest of this episode I'm going to be talking about NAAFA, NAAFA, has come out with a study that they've done on fat bias in the news, and this is just so timely because this came out a few days ago, and I have been talking to my therapist about this, and my portrayal in the program. I mean, it's been since 2019 that I haven't been having to deal with the fallout in my brain of that experience. But specifically, what was really awful is they do something called a master interview. So they'll have lots of kind of, casual interviews where they do one big interview at the beginning. And this is kind of like getting to know you. This is more kind of, here, what are your beliefs? And they will then have more kind of casual things. You're just pottering around the house or whatever, and they'll be like, hey, what's going on? And it'll just be more casual. And then towards the end of the program, they do something, end of the filming, they do something called a master interview, where you go down and you sit in a kind of properly lit studio or room or whatever it is, and you look, in this instance, you look directly into the camera. They had a mirror setup thing where there was a couple of mirrors where you were actually looking into the eyes of the interviewer or producer, and it was actually, you were looking into the lens of the camera, and so you could see their eyes in the lens of the camera. It was kind of weird. I don't know how to explain it, but and so you weren't allowed to, during this master interview, you weren't allowed to do the normal things that you do in a conversations in regards to looking away. I do a lot of looking away, and a lot of like movements you might do, or getting yourself comfortable in the chair or anything like that. You're sat in a chair and you're having to stare directly into the camera, and this interview goes on for hours. And they start soft with things like, well, let's say it's soft. Tell us about your childhood and all the traumas that happened in your childhood. Basically, they're trying to get a reaction. They're trying to get good content of you crying, of you shouting at them, of you storming off or whatever. So they start soft with, like, tell us about your childhood and how terrible it was. And then they get into trying to provoke a reaction from you. And you'll see this in like shows where they're confronting someone, like say if you're watching a show and you've got someone who's done something bad, and then the interviewer is then confronting the person saying, hey, why did you do this bad thing? And eventually the person will take off their mic and leave the room. What you don't see is the lead up to that. What it looks like is someone's like, hey, so tell us about you. And they're like, oh, my name is John Smith. And they say, oh, so did you do anything bad to people? And then John Smith is like, I'm not dealing with these questions, and takes off their mic and leaves. But the reality is there is so much that happens between the first and the last. And it makes John Smith or whoever look like they're very, aha, we've caught them. Haha. And now I know this. I'm like, oh my God, what they're doing is really, really abusive. And, if someone's really actually done something bad, someone's, I don't know, murdered someone or whatever, and then, a confrontation, whatever. But when it's just, soft issues, then I think what they're doing is really inappropriate because, in my interview, and I can't speak to all of them, but I wonder, like, how do they get people to react like that? And I guess some people have a short temper, but I don't think that that's true for everyone. And it's not true for me. Like, I'm not the type to be shouting at people. I'm not the type to be storming off. And they never caught me. They never, caught me doing that because that's not really my personality. And so they just kept asking me really intrusive questions. If you can think of a question that you really wouldn't want someone to ask you, that you'd be like, oh, I'd rather not answer that, So things like, how much money do you make? How much money is in your bank account? And what is your worst memory? What's, things like, you're just like, wow, really? Luckily, because I had done so much therapy, there's lots of traumatic things that happened in my life that I'm able to talk about without crying. And so that was probably frustrating for them, that I was telling stories about, all the trauma that's happened in my life, and I wasn't crying because, that's great TV. And then it got down to them asking me, I can't remember the question exactly, but basically they wanted to get me to say that I don't want to be disabled, that being disabled is bad. And I wouldn't say that, because the question they asked, I can't remember the exact words of the question, but it was an ableist question. Like, what's the premise being, is disability inherently unworthy and undesirable, or something like that? They didn't say it like that, but that was the crux of the question. And I was just like, I'm not answering that question. And they asked me, this guy, he asked me so many times, and I kept saying, I don't feel comfortable asking that question. That is an ableist question. Probably asked me 20 times plus. And I just kept saying, can we move on? And he'd say, okay. And he would ask something else, and then he'd come back to it. No one's going to find out if you say that you don't want to be disabled. You're not going to get in trouble with anyone. So manipulative. And I was like, no, because I'm not. I think that is an inappropriate question. And that's what they ended up airing, is me saying, I'm not answering the question because you're asking me if I would prefer to be non-disabled or not disabled, and that's an ableist question. Like, that's all they got out of me, out of this whole kind of traumatic thing. Anyway, so only a few snippets from that master interview aired, and really the whole premise of that interview is to use you to get reactions, to get content, to make a story. And what they got from me was probably not what they wanted. They wanted me to be badly behaved, and that's just not me. But the story that they crafted is that I was this kind of dickhead, basically. Basically, and I'm not. But, I knew going into it, I knew that the public would be like, oh, fuck this person because they're fat and they don't hate themselves. Obviously, it's awful. But so I was expecting that. What I wasn't expecting was that kind of face-to-face, interpersonal bullying, and, it was just a really awful experience. And obviously still, when people have all these reactions, it's still difficult to know that millions of people have watched you, and a vast majority of them don't like you because of your views of that fat people should be treated with respect and dignity. Yeah, so with that in mind, understanding that, with my personal story, and it's not everyone's story, but in the UK there have been people dying by suicide after being on television, and lives being ruined after being on television. And I always think about these people that we're the people that we are able to clearly see, that's the villain of this story. That person on social media, I really hate them, the way that they behave and the things that they act, say, and all that type of stuff. They're really bad, and that person's really nice. And how much of that do we have to have shades of grey thinking around? Because in reality, that villain is probably not as villainous in real life. That the person who is so sweet and kind is probably not the most perfect person ever. And of course, if someone's saying awful things, then they said those awful things. But yeah, so the way that we're viewing any programs where people are framed in a certain light, thinking twice about how they're being portrayed, and is it absolutely accurate? I know, and in regards to the way that fat folks were portrayed in this show, the fat people who hated themselves. Here's an example: the fat people that hated being fat. We got shots of them eating salads, right? We got shots of them doing good fatty things. The people who liked being fat, we got shots of them eating cake. And me eating Pringles, when we'd all had salad, and then we'd all had cake, but they showed the good fatties eating the salad and the bad fatties eating the cake. And that was just a prime example of manipulating what they're showing to say, well, look at them bad fatties. At least they should have some dignity and try and not eat cake all the time and Pringles all the time, and instead just be good, have salad and try and be thin. Even just talking about this stuff, I feel like there's a trauma response happening in my body. I feel my heart is beating, my breath feels like it's shallower, and I feel tense in my body. So I'm going to move off this subject because it's still very difficult for me. I'm still working out how to deal with it, and try to convince you I'm a good person. I'm not this villainous character that maybe some people saw, and I don't know. And is that helpful for me to try and do that? Working through all of this trauma, it's difficult, but it's important for you to, for me to share my personal experience, because it wasn't okay. And also, let's be cognizant of how we're consuming all types of media. But today we want to talk about fat bias in the news. And we have a gorgeous, amazing report from NAAFA, which is the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, that has been around for more than 50 years. And you can find this report on their website. I'll link to it. What they've done is they've looked at the news and seen how fatness is talked about. And you're probably like, Vinny, I know how fatness is talked about. Yes, but now we have the evidence to show. And if you ever want to cite any of this, and you've got that right now. So I'm just going to read the introduction here. The report is fat bias in the news. Actually, is it? No. it's called The Size of It, Fat Bias in the News. Okay, so welcome. In August of 2022, television host Bill Maher, is it Maher? I don't know who he is really, apart from the fact that he did this, claimed that, quote, "This country has gone from fat acceptance to fat celebration. We at NAAFA, an organization that has been advocating to improve the lives of fat people for more than 50 years, really wish that Maher was right. But as happens a few times a year, somebody with a national platform says terrible things about fat people, generates a lot of chatter on social media and popular media, gets a lot of attention, and then goes back on TV to do it again." Maher is one of many who wring their hands about how the world is, quote, glorifying O-word, when what is actually true is that fat people are neither fully accepted nor celebrated in our culture. Instead, bias against fat people is pervasive, persistent, and life-limiting. The pundits shake their heads. Meanwhile, fat people continue to face discrimination and injustice in nearly every aspect of life. Despite some advances of body diversity in popular culture, health research, and elsewhere, implicit bias against fat people has risen while other kinds of biases have decreased. The news media is contributing to this with a constant stream of fat panic, weight loss content, and erasure of all other kinds of stories about fat people. Those of us who navigate the world in fat bodies know this through experience, but we also know the power of research and evidence. So we asked Pamela Maher, a nationally recognized expert in media research, to review the past year of coverage of weight in the media. So we've got a few bullet points of what the findings show, and then we're going to talk about the methods and some more details. So the findings show there's going to be a big surprise. Like, the findings show exactly what you think the findings might show. So the findings show that diet talk still dominates discussion of higher weight individuals. So when weight is discussed in news, it is dominated by diets. So fat people and the news is always linked with diets. That fat people are almost exclusively discussed in stories about health and healthcare, and the vast majority of these stories make a baseline assumption that fatness is associated with or causes poor health. So what we're learning is from the news is that fatness is there's the assumption that fatness is associated with or causes poor health. That too few of these stories include the perspective of actual fat people, and almost none offer the perspective of fat activists and others talking about fat liberation. Yeah. So a lot of what it is thin people talking about the problem of fatness. Now, what are we going to do with this terrible problem that we have, these terrible unhealthy fat people, and it's thin people who are doing the talking about it? And definitely not people who are committed to the liberation of fat folks. And finally, too many of these stories quote, and then we've got quotes, experts who are part of institutions funded by diet companies and drug manufacturers, giving them a vested interest in continuing fat panic and encouraging weight loss. So we have people who are quote unquote experts on fat people who do not have the lived experience of fatness because they're a thin person being paid by diet companies and drug manufacturers to talk about how fatness is unhealthy and fat people need to diet. So let's go into the methods of this research. But first, why the news matters. Like, why is this important? And why this is really important is because this is how we get our information, right? News, especially certain publications, not all publications, but certain publications have a level of respect and a level of idea that the content of what we read is valid and researched and is true, right? like, so with me doing the BBC documentary, the reason why I did a BBC documentary is because I had the idea that the BBC is this long-running institution that has a responsibility to report factual things, and has this level of trust, right? And so I was like, BBC, I feel like I can trust the BBC. Now, the BBC is not making its programs. It's sent out to production companies, and so there was a production company that made the program for the BBC, and the BBC buy the program, right? And so, by extension, that company was getting, in my mind, the same kind of respect that I no longer have, for the BBC. And so I was like, it's fine, I can just be myself, because they're not gonna, make me look like a clown. Whereas if another company like ITV or Channel 5 in the UK approached me, I'd be like, no thanks, because I know they'd be like really terrible, and they probably would have been even more terrible. But I lost my train of thought. But still, the BBC was still bad, right? And so saying that is, sometimes we have this brand recognition of certain publications where it's like, well, what this publication is saying is true because it's built up this brand reputation, and so we can let our guard down a bit, and versus say, when you read something off some random person's blog or some news website which is that you've not heard of, you'd probably be like, is that true? I don't know. And so a lot of times we will treat news as like an educational device, because we don't have, in our brains, we can't, every time that we read a news article, are we going to be like, okay, I'm going to do some due diligence and see, who's been quoted, and is this true, and are they getting research money from other people, and in regards to fat activism, that's what the fat activists are doing, right? That's what we're doing, is we're looking at that stuff. Whereas the average person who is not interested in certain causes and is not breaking down line by line, person by person, contributor by contributor, of what is this really about? And so we just take it for granted, right? There's probably so many things that I've read that I'm just like, oh, that sounds true, and I just, and now I believe it, because it has no great bearing on my life. But now I'm going through life thinking that, I don't know, aluminium is bad to put in the oven or something. I don't know. I'm trying to think of something that I used to believe that was, that fat people are all unhealthy. And then when so many other people are kind of just buying into that as truth, then it becomes, everyone knows that it's bad to be fat, and it just becomes written in stone. And as well, when we're presented with images and stories of fat folks in a certain way, we cannot help but let those stories get into our brains, and for us to hold stigma, all those images of the headless fatties. And so when I say headless fatties, when you see news stories, and they've got associated images or video with it, you've got the covert filming of fat people with their heads chopped off to give them dignity, so that they are not we don't see they don't get the shame of seeing whose face, but if they saw themselves, they would 100% know it, because they would recognize their body. And you'll see, of them, images of them walking, Images of them eating almost exclusively, will be eating food that people deem as unhealthy. And it's really dehumanizing and fucked up. Fucked up. So this stuff matters, right? This stuff matters. And the way that we're talking about fat people is not cool. So let's talk about the methods of this research. So, quoting, to better understand how the news about weight stigma is framed, I collected and reviewed recent national news coverage. And so that the I is Pamela Mejia, the researcher. Specifically, I used the LexisNexis database to identify news stories that referenced any variation of the term weight stigma, weight discrimination, weight bias, published in US newspapers or wires between December 1st, 2021 and November 30th, 2022. For comparison purposes, I also quantified how many stories during the same time period referenced terms like weight loss, body positivity, or fat justice. So the quantitative numerical analysis. I reviewed articles for quantitative data about when and where they were published and conducted keyword searches to assess how often different terms and phrases like O word or policy, etc. appeared. I also assessed whether articles were traditional news stories or opinion pieces. The qualitative descriptive analysis, I then selected a random sample of articles to review qualitatively, drawing on more than 10 years of experience as a media researcher with expertise in ethnographic content analysis. I reviewed each article in the sample to identify sources quoted, the main topic of the article, and how weight stigma was framed, and other variables. So basically, what's happened here is that Pamela has searched for news stories and wires for stories featuring fatness, and then has selected a sample of those to then go in and read exactly what is being said and what is being reported. So news about weight stigma was sparse. Okay, so the news about fatness almost exclusively was about weight loss or losing weight. So there was 127 articles that used the phrases weight stigma, weight bias, or weight discrimination. By contrast, almost 18,000 articles published in the same time period included at least one reference to weight loss, losing weight, while over 1,000 referenced body positivity. Only 24 articles use a term like fat liberation, fat justice, fat activist, or fat activism. None of the articles about weight stigma also mention fat liberation. So there's a chart here. If you go and have a look at it, the first line, we've got 17,955 articles. When talking about fatness in the news, 18,000 instances were relating to weight loss or losing weight. Then we go down dramatically, right? It's like the difference on this chart. It's a difference between a huge skyscraper and then a tiny house. You know, huge difference. And then we've got 1,200 instances of body positivity being talked about with fatness. Then underneath that, tiny 127. So this is compared to 18,000. 127 mentions of weight stigma, weight discrimination, and only 24 of fat liberation, fat justice, or fat activism. So it's huge, right? Huge, the difference between what is being reported on weight. Just a handful on the fact that weight discrimination exists, or that fat liberation exists. versus the gargantuan 18,000 in regards to weight loss or losing weight. So the next big thing here is that medical professionals and researchers dominated the coverage. So medical professionals and researchers were regularly quoted in news about stigma. Among the researchers most commonly quoted was Rebecca Pull of the Yukon Rudd Center for Food Policy and Health. And so Pull talks about weight stigma, right? Rebecca Pull is a thin woman, and she is the almost majority source on talking about weight stigma, which isn't a problem in itself, right? That it's great that we have people talking about weight stigma, but it should be fat folks who are getting the media coverage to talk about weight stigma. And I mean, Rebecca's done research, right? So that's why that's happened. Fatness was most often characterized using medical language. So even though the O words are slurs, almost the most way that we are being talked about is with using the O words. So almost 2/3 of articles included at least one reference to medical terms, the O words, to refer to fat people. Indeed, a number of articles referred to the O word as a disease. A widely reprinted article, for example, ran under the headline, 1 in 5 children stricken with O word, in different articles. Many stories that described O word as a disease were op-eds written by medical professionals. Terms like fat people or plus size appeared far less frequently in the coverage. A high-profile article from the New York Times about eating disorders, for example, described efforts of a small vanguard of professionals experimenting with ways to improve treatment for people with larger bodies. Oh, it's that one that I did You Don't Look Anorexic, the one where they talked to, that was good, the one where they talked to fat folks with anorexia. Okay, so most articles framed stigma in the context of healthcare. So the majority of articles framed weight stigma in the context of access to medical care. As noted elsewhere, the overwhelming majority of stories that referenced weight stigma were press releases from companies or research institutions releasing data or announcements of new weight loss products. Ding, 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 ding. So this is something that we talk about on the podcast, the fact that weight loss drug companies, manufacturing companies, bariatric surgery companies are co-opting the language of fat activists and talking about weight stigma, and their solution to weight stigma is to get rid of the fat people, because if there's no fat people, you're not going to experience weight stigma. Great idea. Not. It's so infuriating. And so people are like, yeah, that's a great idea. We do need to stop weight stigma. People who don't know better, we do need to stop weight stigma. Yes, it is a great idea. Take your drug to lose weight. Great idea. Okay, let's do it. Because it's not that egregious, fuck the fat people. They have to get smart with their marketing messages, right? Only rarely did articles address the impact of weight stigma on health and emotional outcomes for adults and children. Aha! One op-ed author, for example, cited data illustrating that the emotional toll of weight discrimination alone may be enough to manifest negative consequences. Another widely reprinted news article focused on O-word as a disease to be cured, but did include quotes from a doctor who lamented, "The way that we treat children and adults who have high weight is really shameful. When people do not meet a certain societal ideal of children, young children feel the same." So here's another thing that we see is that articles that talk about weight stigma still really struggle. You can see that the author really struggles with, well, we can't just say the fat people should just be fat. That would be irresponsible. So we shouldn't be mean to the fat people, but it needs to be cured. Like this example saying that it's a disease and it needs to be cured. So sometimes you think that you think that you're reading something that is fat positive, and then you're like, wah, wah, wah. Oh shit. You're really excited. You're like, yes, this is great. And then at the bottom, it'll be like, well, still, we don't be fat, Don't be so fat, God. And even like this one, okay, so this is the one that they've quoted, like, it's called, yes, you can be both fat and healthy. So if I saw that, I would be like, yes. But immediately goes into kind of things that, not so great, not so great things. Someone who's well-meaning, but like, so for example, as of 2021, weight-based discrimination remains one of the only lasting legal and socially accepted forms of discrimination in the United States. Okay, so I hate when people say it's one of the only lasting socially accepted forms of discrimination in the United States. Okay, so this is kind of like old school fat activism to say socially acceptable. Legal, yes, that's true in a lot of different places, not exclusively, because there are other ways that you're legally allowed to discriminate against people, but socially accepted forms of discrimination. It is, of course, socially acceptable to discriminate against fat people, but it is of course, also socially acceptable to discriminate against many other marginalized identities without reprisal, without thinking twice. And you may say, well, not for me, but it is for many people. It is for many people absolutely A-OK to be transphobic, A-OK to be racist, A-OK to be etc., right? A-OK to be misogynistic. If we're thinking about what's his name, matey, who's like the most Googled man, Andrew Tate. I watched the Vice documentary on him last night. I mean, his millions of followers, would they say that it's okay to discriminate against women, to be violent towards women, to SA women? Yes. So is weight-based discrimination the only socially accepted form of discrimination? No, it's not. But I see what people are. I understand what people are saying. Anyway, moving on. We're getting into the weeds, the weeds of little things where I'm like, it's not true. But I it's kind of like a well-meaning misconception, which I have previously made until someone corrected me a few years ago. Okay, policies to address weight stigma were rarely discussed in depth. Though 1/3 of stories did include at least one reference to policies, few articles substantively addressed policies designed to address weight stigma. A rare example was an op-ed from the Press of Atlantic City that argued a proposed bill for prohibiting prejudice on the basis of weight and or height in hiring, housing, and educational practices. The editorial board concluded the bottom line is that judging someone's natural appearance and holding it against them in any way is unfair and should stop. That's nice. That's nice to hear that they said their natural appearance, saying that weight is just a natural appearance. The limitations on this analysis is limited to English language print news sources. It did not include other forms of traditional news media, such as television or radio. In addition, although I adhered as closely as possible to best practices in ethnographic content analysis, I was not able to conduct inter-rater reliability testing or use multiple coders to assess content. So they have recommendations. There are many ways that the media could improve coverage of fat people to accurately reflect our lives and to reduce stigma. Oh, you know what? I was just watching The Tourist on Prime. It came out a year ago, and I was like, finally, okay, I'm going to watch it. It has Danielle MacDonald in it. Danielle MacDonald was Patty Cakes in Patty Cakes. She was also in Dumpling alongside Jennifer Aniston, amazing Australian fat actor. She's great. Anyway, so she's in this. She's the second star in it. Excited, and so I started watching it. First episode. What do you think her storyline is? Oh my god, is it that she wants to lose weight? Yes, it is. She's at a weight loss meeting. Yes. And is her partner a dickhead to her? Yes, he is. He's also fat and he is mean. But then, actually, you know what? That was the first episode. Feel like it gets better. Like there is not any continued weight loss talk, and there is a surprise in one of the episodes. I'm not going to say in case you watch it, but you know, that's just how fat people are perceived. Like she's like in a shit relationship and wants to lose weight. Oh, boring. Boring. Yes, I know that that's many fat people's realities. But really, can we get some more stories? Can we get some more fat joy stories? Because the overwhelming representation of fat folks is a sad sack, you know? Anyway, okay, so journalists and editors this is how we can do it better. Tell more stories about fat people's rights and how we overcome stigma, weight bias, and outright discrimination at work, at play, and among family and friends. Yes. Could you imagine if there was a story about like a fat person who was like encoded in their office workplace culture that no diets was allowed, and then other people were like, this was amazing, my workplace is really cool now thanks to that fat hero, and then the news was like, this is amazing, we should treat fat people like people, whoa, and it'd just be a feel-good story. Wouldn't that be cool? Decrease reliance on medical research to drive story ideas and write fewer stories about fat people in health, wellness, and disease context. Yes. Explore other markers of health and interventions that increase people's wellness, including systemic changes that increase access to health, healthy healthcare, healthy behaviors, and reduce stigma. Yes. Expand your definition of experts on fatness beyond people with a medical or public health background. Include academics doing research in fat studies, as well as folks active in and leading the movement for fat rights and fat liberation. Imagine that. A story about fatness where fat people talk about it. Wild. Where it's not thin people. What? That is too much to handle. Seek out fat experts for your opinion pages, including those who question or have rejected weight loss culture and diet goals. When quoting researchers or medical professionals, identify connections they have to diet industry and pharmaceutical funding that may influence their perspectives. Oh, that would be so good, wouldn't it? It'd be like, quote, fat people need to lose weight, says researcher who has been donated 100,000 by weight loss drug companies. That would be so fucking good. Or just not even quote them at all. Include more fat activists and fat liberationists in your coverage of civil rights, elections, and other social justice issues. Yes. Amazing. Language. Avoid the O words. When speaking of clothes, use industry term plus size, extended size, or big and tall. Never use the phrase for everybody or for all sizes. Yes, that gets on my flaps. We're making clothes for all sizes. We go up to XL. So huge. Oh my god, everyone can fit now. Fat activists and fat liberationists often refer to themselves as fat, and that term should be used at the subject's request, including a short explainer. Treat fat subjects with care and dignity, using language and descriptions that they prefer. Imagery. The recommendation on imagery is include larger body people in your photos and illustrations of stories that don't have anything to do with body size. We exist in other contexts. Yes. Include pictures of our full body when practical versus the headless fatty. Avoid weight loss before and after juxtapositions. Do not use filters or Photoshop to make us appear less fat. Do not use anonymized fat people, i.e. no heads, no faces. Many stock photo galleries only feature fat people in stereotypical portrayals or in weight loss pursuits. If your publication typically utilizes stock galleries, plan for the possibility that you may need to arrange for alternative photos that show fat people diversely and authentically. Yeah, you know what? Like, for example, you can go to the companies that are talking about weight bias and how it's bad, but also that fat people don't need to exist. They often have stock photos available. And all of the stock photos are fat people at the gym, fat people eating an apple, and it's like, really? Do you really know anything about weight stigma if all of the photos that you have are fat people doing these things associated with health? No. Make sure photo shoot locations are accessible for larger bodies. In conclusion, this report shows that the media has a long way to go to accurately and compassionately report on fat people and our efforts to improve access and opportunity. However, we do see progress, and we know that progress is possible, as we have witnessed that the media contribute to better understanding of LGBTQ people, victims of police violence, and more. At the time of this writing, there are active campaigns for legislation to protect fat people from discrimination in 3 states and the city of New York. This is an important moment with many more to come, and we hope the media takes this opportunity to cover these groundbreaking campaigns and their impact. Because ultimately, the way that the media covers fat people and weight bias is not a matter of semantics, consideration, or kindness. Contributing to a better understanding of fat people, the challenges we face, and our efforts to alleviate those challenges can be life-saving intervention if we can reduce stigma and increase access to healthcare, housing, employment, and all the markers of a full and fulfilling life. Beautiful. Love it. So yes, you can go get this, so you can go and quote it and whatnot. I'll make this report into a social media post that's easily shareable. And amazing. Thank you to NAAFA for doing this work. Love it. And here's a little tip for you. You know, when you're consuming the news, if you see something that is anti-fat, just don't read it. Just don't watch it. Unless you're doing some type of analysis for some reason, just don't do it. Don't put yourself through that. Don't give them the clicks. Just don't. And if you're not sure, if you'll see something which is, you're like, oh, this could be positive, here's a little tip for you. If you're reading it on your computer, your phone or whatever, do a control F. Find and just put in the O words. Don't put O words. Write them out. See if they come up, and see in what context. Is it like quoting the O words, like, we don't use the O words in this article because they're fucked up? Or is it like, O word people are greedy and horrible? Then you can be like, yeah, well, this is not great. Or if it's like quoting an O word expert and a researcher who, if they're calling themselves an O word researcher, you know that they're steeped in weight bias. So protect that gorgeous little brain of yours. Not little brain, you've got a big juicy brain. Just protect it, and look out for those things, because, you know, honestly, I've been doing this for years, and still, if I'm exposed to bias, it will affect me. You know, it's impossible for it not to. And so, if you're newer in your journey, then it's definitely gonna affect you. If you're newer in your journey, there's more evidence to prove that your body is bad, right? So be really careful about that stuff that you consume, because it's even if you were like, this isn't true, you know, it could be just seeping into your brain, you know, osmosis or something. All right, well, go share that NAAFA report analysis, and if you would like to contribute towards the show, buy me a coffee or subscribe and get some goodies, go to Ko-fi, link in the show notes, and I'm gonna go and try and de-stress from thinking about. I'm feeling so much shame right now. I'm feeling so much shame from thinking about that show. Oh, no, I shouldn't feel shame. Shame is such a motherfucker, right? Oh, I did a whole Brené Brown course on shame. Shame is such a big driver in my life of trying to keep me small. Is my brain is like, I'm gonna shame them, and it works. But I'm guessing that we all feel shame. Most of us will feel shame, and so I'm gonna presume that you're gonna hold me in that feeling of the shame and say, Vinny, you don't deserve to feel shame. You deserve to feel good and happy. And here's my message to you: is you don't deserve to feel shame. And sometimes shame is helpful, right? Like if you go around kicking kittens in the face, then that shame is probably good to feel. But if it's shame that's unhelpful and undeserved and something that you're having to work through, then I hope you get relief from it, and I hope I get relief from it too. Yeah. Okay, well, thanks for hanging out with me today, and I'll see you on the next episode. Bye.